Hello my dear friends, you're in the Military of a Summary channel, and today we will discuss the situation in Ukraine on the 9th of June of 2025. Today we have a lot of very interesting updates, so let's start. And this video I would like to continue with massive missile and drone strike that took place during the previous night. I'll remind you that according to Ukrainian sources, the Russians attacked the Ukraine once again, and the Russians used hundreds of drones and dozens of missiles. But telling the truth, we haven't received almost anything during the previous 24 hours regarding that attack. For example, if we compare this attack with the previous attack that took place on the 6th of June of 2025, then we can say that it was two completely different attacks. For example, on the 6th of June, we got dozens of videos of missiles, dozens of explosions, of roads of attacks with Russian cruise and Iskander missiles, lots of explosions, complete absence of air defense system of the armored forces of Ukraine, and many other evidences and proofs that confirmed Russian massive missile strike that took place by the 6th of June of 2025. But when talking about the 9th of June, we have almost nothing. The only thing we have probably is that the report of the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation, and we have two articles that were published by the Ukrainian side. This is, for example, the first article that was published by the Ukrainians, and in this article we can see that during the night the Ukrainians managed to destroy 479 targets out of 499 targets, and furthermore we have this map, the map of roads. And when talking about this map, obviously the map is very interesting, because when talking about this map, as you can see, the Russians were attacking several positions, several areas of Ukraine. The Russians attacked the city of Kiev itself. This is the place of a concentration of roads of attacks. The Russians attacked Snake Island, that is located in the southern part of Ukraine, and the Russians attacked just one area in the western part of Ukraine. We will discuss this in details. So that's it. We don't have anything else. So we don't have missiles flying above Ukraine. We don't have explosions. We don't have anything that can confirm Russian massive missile strike. So let's discuss in details. When talking about Snake Island, we don't know for sure what exactly the Russians were attacking. The only thing we know that the Russians used Ha-22 missile. Most likely the Ukrainians were using this Snake Island for further operations deep inside of the Black Sea, or the Ukrainians were using these islands to prepare operations in the direction of the Crimea. When talking about the city of Kiev, everything is clear. The Russians, as usual, were bombing and attacking some positions of the armored forces of Ukraine, but the Russians were destroying some warehouses, ammo depots, and so on. The most interesting information is coming from the western part of Ukraine, because during the previous 24 hours, the Russians attacked Airfield of Dubno. So we have one video, one article that was published by Ukrainian sources, and here we can see how Ukrainian missiles, how Russian missiles were flying in the direction of the airfield of Dubno. But telling the truth, I can't tell you 100% sure that this video was made during the previous 24 hours. Maybe this video was made a long time ago, but the author of this article decided to use this video to show how the missiles were flying in the direction of the city. So the Russians attacked this airfield, and this is very interesting. We have a lot of articles, lots of different statements that were made by different sources regarding the situation in this area. When summarizing everything that was discussed during the previous 24 hours, the Russians most likely, as a result of this attack with missiles and drones in the area of airfield of Dubno, destroyed up to 5 MiG-25 aircrafts of the armored forces of Ukraine, 5 MiG-29s of the armored forces of Ukraine, and according to information we have, most likely there was also one F-16. So maybe the Russians, as a result of this attack, managed to destroy this F-16 aircraft as well. So this is the purpose of Russian massive missile strike that took place during the previous night. Once again, when talking about types of weapon that the Russians used, first the Russians attacked this area with ground drones, trying to overdose or trying to probably stress Ukrainian air defense. Then the Russians sent several cruise missiles, and in the end the Russians attacked this territory with Kinzhal hypersonic missile. So once again, we don't know for sure whether the Russians managed to destroy anything, but once again, according to several sources, the Russians most likely or probably or very likely managed to destroy one F-16 at this airfield. But this F-16 is very interesting topic with these F-16s, because today the Ukrainians published very interesting situation regarding F-16. For example, if you remember, several days ago we got report that the Russians lost another Su-35 in the Kursk direction. So the Russians were supporting their offensive operation in the Sumy region, and the Russians were using Su-35, Su-30 for those purposes. And according to information we have, the Russians deployed a modern Su-35, and according to information we have, the Ukrainians sent their F-16, and the Ukrainians reported that the Ukraine airborne a Swedish Sub-340, which detected the Russian aircraft 300 kilometers from the border and relayed coordinates to the F-16. And F-16 launched an AIM-120 missiles that shot down the Russian Su-34 near Koryovo in the Kursk region. So the Ukrainians are saying that for the first time in the history, in the modern history, the US-made F-16 destroyed Russians-made Su-35. As for now, we can't confirm this information. It's just talks and rumors and statements and articles that were published by pro-Ukrainian sources. Of course, it's better to get additional proofs if this information is correct. Another important thing is connected with the prison exchange. According to information we have today, both the Russians and the Ukrainians carry out another exchange process according to agreements reached on the June 2nd in Istanbul. So as for the end of the 9th of June, both the Russians and the Ukrainians returned back servicemen under 25 years of age. And but the most important thing of this exchange, that neither the Russians nor the Ukrainians provided the exact number of soldiers that were returned back to Russia and to Ukraine. So for some reason, both the Russians and the Ukrainians decided to classify this information. So this is very interesting, because usually in the past, when Ukrainians or the Russians were returning back from this situation, we always got the numbers, how many Russians returned, how many Ukrainians returned, but today we got nothing. Another important article today was published by the Politico. According to information we have, the Russians prepared 6,000 dead bodies to return back to Ukraine, and we discussed that if Russians return these 6,000 bodies to Ukraine, then Zelensky would be forced to pay up to 2 billion to relatives and parents of these soldiers. And today the Politico reported that Russia has at least 40,000 more Ukrainian military bodies prepared to attack the Ukrainian economy. Just 6,000 Ukrainian soldiers waiting at the border will cost the Ukrainian economy more than 2 billion. So if Russia return additional 40,000, this will increase let's say the cost to Ukrainian economy to probably 15 billion. Currently, Ukraine doesn't have this money because Ukraine was already recognized as a bankrupt by the Western bank system, according to some kind of papers and something like this. So we see the situation is very interesting, and telling the truth, I'm not even sure that 40,000 is the final number. The thing is that if you remember, in December and November of 2024, in the latest probably president campaign of Donald Trump, there were lots of talks about the losses from the Russian side, about the losses from the Ukrainian side, and Trump provided his own numbers regarding the losses. Then Zelensky made his own statement regarding the words of Donald Trump, and Zelensky stated, if you remember, that since the beginning of the special military operation, Ukraine lost just 42,000 soldiers. So by the beginning of 2025, Ukraine lost around 42,000 soldiers. So if we and which means that according to Zelensky and according to this number of bodies that Russia has, that means that Ukrainians lost most of their soldiers during the Kursk offensive operation or something like this, because the Russians are able to return 46,000, which according to Zelensky is a total number of losses since the beginning of the special military operation. And obviously this can be a huge media bomb for Ukraine. Of course, the Russians is not the only side that was attacking Ukraine during the previous 24 hours. I'm talking about missile attack, about this media attack with bodies and so on. Today, the Ukrainians attacked deep inside of the territory of the Russian Federation as well. And according to information we have, the Ukrainians attacked the settlement of Cheboksary. And in this video, we can see the consequences of Ukraine attack. And in this video, we can see another drone attack that was carried out by the Ukrainians. This is not a Giran, this is a Ukrainian type of drone, Luty, by the name of Iluti, and this is the second drone that attacked this factory. As you can see, the factory was heavily damaged, and the sources are saying that there were no casualties among civilians, but the sources reported that the Russians were forced to close this factory. This factory the Russians were using for different important equipment and parts for missiles, drones, and many other military objects and military weapons. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Ukrainians carried out HIMARS strike in the area of Rylsk. We have several reports that were published both by the Russians and by the Ukrainians. We have some picture with smoke, with consequences of Ukraine attack, and later we got official statement that was made by the by the group of forces North. They published a very interesting statement post in their Telegram channel. They stated that Ukrainians attacked the headquarters of the 155th Separate Marine Brigade. This is very powerful brigade, and now this brigade is an offensive in the Sumy direction. So very interesting. As for now, we don't know for sure about the losses from the Russian side, but most likely the losses were very heavy. Now let's talk about the situation on the ground, and let's first start with the Sumy direction. First, let's talk about the settlement of Tyotkina. It seems that Ukrainians came to conclusion that they have no chances to establish control over the settlement of Tyotkina, because today, for the first time since the beginning of the battle for the settlement, the Russian sources began publishing information that Ukrainians decided to redeploy the units of the 33rd Assault Regiment, 225th Assault Regiment, and 425th Assault Regiments to other directions. The Ukrainians are saying that they're redeploying them, but probably to reinforce this or that area. But telling the truth, we believe that Ukrainians are redeploying these units right now, either because these units lost their combat capabilities during the battle for Tyotkina, and now they need to be replaced and something like this, or the Ukrainians decided to probably stop offensive operation and to probably remove these forces from the line of combat contact. Anyway, the situation is very difficult when talking about the first option. We need to expect additional forces in this area, but most likely this is not going to happen, because now Ukrainians have huge problems in the area of Sumy. Once again, when talking about the Sumy offensive operation, as we discussed in the previous videos, we can split this territory for 4 regions, for 4 sectors. The western sector of the Sumy offensive, the central sector of the Sumy offensive, the eastern sector of the Sumy offensive, and the southeastern sector of the Sumy offensive. The Russians are trying to attack along every single sector in this area, and the situation differs from sector to sector. So let's discuss this in details. When talking about the most western flank, the most western sector, the first sector, the Russians managed to complete every single task they were tasked before this offensive operation. Furthermore, according to first geolocations, we see that the Russians began attacking, bombing, and making attempts to attack in the direction of Khotin and Pisarevka. In this video, we can see how Russians were bombing the village of Khotin with FABs, which means that the Russians began preparation before the beginning of their offensive operation in this direction. Furthermore, the Russians intensify the use of drones in this area as well, which also means the same. The Russians finished the battle for the first defense layer, and now the Russians are about to finish the preparation before the battle for the second defense layer, and the battle for the second defense layer is going to start very soon. When talking about the central offensive sector, according to information we have today, by the end of the 9th of June of 2025, the Russians finished the battle for the first defense layer. So according to information we have, the Russians control everything along this red line and further in the northern direction, which means that the first defense layer was taken by the Russians, and most likely during the next days, several days, the Russians will continue offensive operation further in the southern direction, and the battle for the second defense layer is going to start. When talking about the most eastern, let's say, sector, the situation here remains tense. The Russians continue attempts to enter the village of Yunakiivka and to dig in deeper and to force the Ukrainians to fall back, but we see that something goes wrong. Either the Russians don't have this task to establish complete control over the settlement. Maybe the main purpose of the Russians is just to pin down Ukrainians and to force the Ukrainians to bring more and more reinforcements and reserves in this direction, or the Russians are facing probably fierce resistance from the Ukrainian side. As for now, we don't know for sure, but one thing we know for sure, that's the Russians on the western and on the central flanks finished the battle for the first defense layer. And when talking about the eastern flank, we see that there are still a lot of job to do for these purposes. And most likely this is the reason why the Russians were forced to begin another offensive operation in the southeastern flank, in the southeastern sector. And the main purpose of this attack of the armored forces of the Russian Federation is to outflank the settlement of Yunakievka from the south and from the southeast. As for this sector, during the previous 24 hours we haven't received anything special, just one video that was published by the Ukrainians, where Ukrainians were trying to counterattack Russians using vehicles, but all Ukrainian counterattacks were repelled by the Russians and FPV drones. Ukrainians suffered losses and the Russians continued their offensive operation. So this is the situation in this direction. Furthermore, I would like to remind you that according to information we have, the Russians introduced additional reinforcements and reserves in this area. 40 plus trucks with ammo and personnel were deployed by the Russians in this direction. Lots of artillery systems, lots of equipment and vehicles. So we are about to see the second wave of the Russian offensive operation, and this is going to be the battle for the second defense layer, not for the city of Sumy itself. Now let's move further and let's discuss the situation in the Kupiansk direction. During the previous 24 hours, we haven't received anything special. The Russians were bombing and attacking Ukrainian forces. During the previous days, we got a lot of videos how the Russians were destroying Ukrainian logistic. The Russians destroyed or damaged or attacked once again the bridge that was created and established by the Ukrainians in the vicinity of the Kupiansk of Uzlavoy. Furthermore, we got another video how the Russians were attacking Ukrainian positions in the vicinity of another roads between the settlement of Sinkovo and Kruglakovka. So, and that's it. When talking about the Kupiansk direction, nothing special, just this. FPV drone attacks, artillery strikes, attacks on Ukrainian logistic. When talking about the city of Siversk during the previous 24 hours, we got just this one very interesting article. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions between the villages of Verkhnykamensk and Grigorovka. This allowed the Russians to shorten the distance to the positions of the armored forces of Ukraine on the territory of Serebrenka till 3 kilometers. So the battle for this territory is about to be started, most likely. Now let's talk about the Konstantinovka direction, because the most important updates are coming exactly from this area. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions along the entire line of combat contact, starting from the city of Chasiv and ending along the N32 road. So let's start from the beginning, and first let's talk about the city of Chasiv. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians improved their positions in the area of the village of Stupochki. And in this video we can see how Russians raised their flag in this area. This building was located. You know one thing, that's the Ministry of Defense of the Russian Federation 2 or 3 or 4 weeks ago reported that the village of Stupochki was taken by the Russians, but 4 weeks ago, let's call it like this, the Russians reported about control with this territory, but without any proofs. The Russians didn't provide any video with the Russian flag, the Russians didn't show any video where the Russian soldiers were moving through the settlement, so nothing. And 4 weeks ago, let's call it like this, we adjusted the map in this area in the Russian favor. And just now the Russians provided us some proofs, which means that just now by the end of the 9th of June of 2025, the Russians managed to secure this territory completely and to force the Ukrainians to fall back. Most likely during the previous months, the Ukrainians carried out hundreds of attacks, counterattacks with the purpose to restore control over the village. The Russians repelled everything, and today they announced about total and complete victory over this territory. Now the Russians are going to move further, obviously in the direction of the settlement by the name of Pritiechina. Now let's move further. Let's discuss the situation in the area between the city of Toretsk and the city of Konstantinovka. Today, pro-Ukrainian sources published this video, very important video, where we can see how Ukrainian FPV drone operators were attacking Russians in this area. And as a result of attacks, the Russians suffered losses. But this is not the most important. The most important thing is that the Russians improved their positions according to this video. During that video, we could see several episodes and two places were geolocated. Ukrainians attacked Russians in this point, and Ukrainians attacked Russians in this point, which means that during the previous days the Russians improved their positions and established complete control and additional control to the north of the city of Toretsk. Furthermore, now we see that the Russians are trying to outflank and to take in pincers Ukrainian strongholds in this area. So now the Russians are focused to establish complete control over this territory. This complex network of the fortifications is located on the elevation, and if the Russians are able to establish complete control over this territory and to force Ukrainians to fall back, this is going to be the beginning of the biggest disaster for the armored forces of Ukraine in the Konstantinovka direction since the beginning of the special military operation. Because if the Russians are able to take this stronghold, this dense network of the fortifications under complete control, then the Russians would be able to shorten the distance, let's say from this stronghold to the Kliban-Byksky water reservoir to the distance of 1.5 kilometers, which is already nothing. And the Ukrainians will have just one road for supply and support on and for evacuation. We're talking about this 0522 road that Ukrainians use to supply and support their contingent in the area between the settlements of Sherbinovka, Novospaska, Katerinovka and Kliban-Byk. So, of course, if the Russians are going to cut Ukrainians in cauldron in this area, it's not just enough to, let's say, take under control this company's stronghold. First of all, the Russians need to cut another supply line that Ukrainians use. We are talking about N20 road and then 0524 road between the settlements of Konstantinovka and Kliban-Byk. If the Russians are able to cut this territory, then this is going to be the beginning of the disaster we've just discussed. But telling the truth and summarizing everything that we got during the previous 24 hours, we see that the Russians are very close to achieve this victory, because today we got the most important geolocation from the southern part of the settlement of Alexander Kalinova. This is exactly the video where I'm talking about, and according to this video, at least 2 Russian motorcycles entered the settlement of Alexander Kalinova from the south. So in this video we can see 2 Russian motorcycles that were entering the village, and the Russians were moving from the south in the northern direction. So this is approximately the road of Russian offensive, and as a result of attack, the Russians entered the most southern part. And currently, we don't know for sure, nobody knows, telling the truth, what is the exact status of Russian positions in this area, whether the Russians managed to improve their positions, whether the Russians managed to dig in deeper, we don't know for sure. So nobody knows, telling the truth, just probably the soldiers on the ground. But anyway, if the Russians are able to save their positions in this area to establish complete control at least over the southern part, then the distance between these edge positions and the Kliban-Bykskaya water reservoir would be less than 2.5 kilometers. And if the Russians from these positions are able to move further in the northeastern direction, then the Russians would be able to cut N20 road and 0524 road, and this will lead to complete collapse of Ukrainian positions in the pocket we've just discussed. So the Russians now need to establish complete control over just these territories, and as you can see, according to the latest geolocations, this is exactly what the Russians are doing right now. If the Russians are able to take this territory under complete control, basically to capture the village Alexander Kalinova, this will lead to the situation that Ukrainians in this pocket would be caught in complete cauldron without any chances for evacuation. And the main problem and the main interesting thing about this situation is that this is the area of the responsibilities of the 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov. This brigade used to be responsible for the Battle of Mariupol. So as you can see, there are very high chances that the Russians can take this brigade, 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov, the second time in a cauldron since the beginning of the special military operation, and this can be the biggest media victory of the Russians ever. So this is the situation. We see that the situation remains tense for the Ukrainians, and telling the truth, I'm not even sure what the Ukrainians are going to do, but telling the truth, we expect that the units of the 12th Special Purpose Brigade Azov will not hold their positions for a very long period of time, because they understand what is waiting for them in the Russian prison. Now let's move further. At the same time, the Russians continue their offensive operation on the western flank of this village of Yablunovka. During the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue offensive operation, and according to information we have, currently the clashes are taking place for the central part of the settlement. So this is another point of pressure, another point where the Russians are going to break through Ukrainian defense. So we see that the situation to the south of the city of Konstantinovka has become critical. And telling the truth, we expect that the battle for the city of Konstantinovka itself is going to start very, very soon. Now let's move further. We'll skip the Pokrovsk probably direction. We haven't received anything special. And now let's talk about the Dnipro direction. According to information we have, during the previous 24 hours, the Russians managed to improve their positions significantly. And first of all, let's talk about the Dnipro Oblast itself. Today, the Russian sources and the Minister of Defense of the Russian Federation reported that the Russians continue improving their positions on the territory of the Dnipro region. And during the previous 24 hours, the Russians continue sending more and more forces in this area. And the Russian sources published this video where we can see how Russians were crossing the border and how Russian soldiers were entering the Dnipro region. This episode was geolocated exactly in this point, and based on this video we have adjusted the map. And currently, according to geolocations that we got yesterday and today, we see that the Russians control around 2 kilometers along the border, and the Russians continue improving their positions and consolidating their troops. Furthermore, according to information we have, the Russians secured the village of Goryokhova. As for the end of the 9th of June of 2025, this information yet hasn't been confirmed by the Minister of Defense, but we expect that this is going to happen very soon. Furthermore, the Russians continue their offensive operation in the village of Alexeyevka. According to information we have, the Russians entered the central part of the settlement, and currently the clashes are ongoing. The Russians are about to probably break through another Ukrainian defense belt and to force Ukrainians to fall back in the western direction. At the same time, another group of Russian forces attacked the settlement of Alexeyevka from the southwest. Currently, according to information we have, there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Zelyony Kut. If the Russians are able to take this village also under complete control, this will cut the last line of supply and support for those Ukrainians who are currently located on the territory of Alexeyevka. So as we can see, the situation here is very critical, and the Ukrainians most likely during the next several days would be forced to fall back first in the northern direction, and they will consolidate themselves along the dense network of the fortifications, and a few days more and the Ukrainians would be forced to fall back in the direction of the Dnipro region through the fields. Otherwise, they could be caught in cauldron by the Russians. Another interesting situation, another interesting story is developing on the territory of Kamar. I'll remind you that the Russians began offensive operation in this area, and during the previous several days the Russians managed to improve their position significantly. First, the Russians secured the village of Fedorovka to the south of Kamar, then we got reports that the Russians answered the village itself, and according to information we have, currently there are very heavy clashes. But we expect that during the next 48 hours the Russians will report about complete control over the village of Kamar. And the most interesting thing is that today several pro-Russian resources published this video. And in this video we can see several bridges along the river of Mokre Yali in the western and the northwestern of the part of the village of Kamar. Basically, these two villages, these two bridges are the only supply and support roads that Ukrainians have in this area. And today the Russians reported that Ukrainians, for some reason, decided to destroy both bridges. So now Ukrainians who are currently located on the territory of the settlement of Kamar were caught by the Russians without any possibilities for evacuation in the western direction, because the Ukrainians, probably from the village of Mirne, decided to destroy the bridges along the river of Mokre Yali with the purpose not to allow the Russians to establish control over them. So Ukrainians were cut from supply. Obviously, this will lead to unpredictable consequences. Obviously, the Ukrainians in Kamar have no chances for evacuation because the bridges were destroyed, and if they decide to move through the river, obviously they would be attacked by the Russian FPV drones. The Ukrainians can't move in the northern direction because they would be attacked by the Russian artillery and drones as well. So this is the situation. Once again, we expect the fall of the settlement in the very near future. Furthermore, the fall of the village of Kamar opens the Russians the window of opportunities, because now with the control of the village of Kamar, the Russians would be able to move further in the northwestern direction with the purpose to establish complete control over the settlements along these lines of attack. We are talking about Поддубное, Мирное, Alexandragrad, Yanvarskaya, Voskresenka, Malinovka, and Shevchenka. And this is a logical Russian attack, because by these roads of attack, the Russians will be able to establish complete control over Donetsk region in this part of this oblast. When talking about the Zaporozhye and Gulay-Pole directions, the Russians continue their offensive operation. Currently, there are very heavy clashes for the settlement of Malinovka and Poltavka. The Russians are reducing these two villages to ruins by bombing and attacking them with FABs and artillery and flamethrower systems. Most likely, the Ukrainians show fierce resistance in this area, because during the previous days, the Russians made attempts to answer the villages, but most likely those attempts were repelled by the Ukrainians, and now the Russians decided to use heavy artillery to reduce Ukrainian resistance. Most likely the Russians soon will resume their attempts to attack in this area. When talking about the Zaporozhye direction, the biggest, probably the main activities are taking place in the vicinity of Mala Takhmachka. The Russians are about to begin their major offensive operation in this area with the purpose to establish complete control over the villages and towns around the city of Orekhov itself. And that's it for today. Military Summary channel reminds we condemn any violence in the world. Thank you for watching, subscribe to my channel, put your likes, join my Patreon, and have a good day. Bye bye.